Photographic Composition, Lecture 9, The Natural Landscape, Part 1. This image by Stephen Shore that was made in the 70s during one of his cross-country trips, photographing using an 8x10 camera. This was in Oregon and depicts a billboard in the middle of a rather spectacular landscape. The billboard appears contained and kind of serene, except that what was presumably text has been painted over. For what reason is anybody's guess. So it leaves this as an image loaded with irony. The Western landscape in the United States drew photographers right after the Civil War in the late 1860s. And a number of photographers were commissioned to accompany geological surveys with the intention of bringing back evidence of these places that most people had only heard about. The ultimate intention being to create the National Park Service, which they were able to do quite handily. Timothy O'Sullivan was one of those photographers. He had been a war photographer. And he accompanied a number of these expeditions, and would stop wherever the landscape spoke to him and would record an image. When we look at these, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind was the arduousness of making this work. These images were made primarily with large cameras, at least 8x10, very often even larger. The negatives were made on glass plates and could not be reused because the minute they were reused, when the emulsion was washed off, that was it. The image was gone. So they would load as many plates as they possibly could, and when they ran out of plates, they turned around and went home. William Henry Jackson, another of the photographers whose work I'm going to show, in fact, this is a Jackson, talks about going up a mountain pass with on horseback. He also had mules and donkeys that carried his equipment, and apparently one of them got spooked on the way up this pass, and it happened to be carrying the negatives that he had made up to that point, and they'd been in the field for about 3 months, and it got spooked and went over the side, of course dying and bringing all of the negatives with him. So Jackson had no recourse but to turn around and go back home and wait for the next expedition to take him out to the west. So the idea here was to convey how otherworldly, how unlike any other landscapes in the world these were. And when Congress saw these pictures, there was no question that a National Park Service was going to be started, and it exists to this day. A lot of these images have degraded in one way or another. The prints have faded, but also most of the emulsions of this day were particularly blue sensitive, so skies tended to be virtually blank. But it also meant if you were looking into relatively deep space, say in a situation like this, that atmospheric haze would build up because it has primarily blue light in it, and would get lighter and lighter and therefore show less and less clearly what's going on as it gets further and further from the camera. Carlton Watkins was another California photographer. He was, in fact, the first photographer to go to Yosemite. We're all very, I think, used to seeing views of Yosemite, but these were the first ones. He also photographed in other areas. He lived in San Francisco, and in fact, a great deal of his work was lost during the earthquake and fire in 1906. But fortunately, there were prints and other examples of his work that had made their way into other places and were preserved. This is an unusual round print. Not quite sure why they did this. Someone thought it was a good idea. I don't know that it was Watkins, though. One of the things that most of these landscape photographers, these early ones anyway, would try to do is show as much in any given image as they possibly could. So in an instance like this, we can see one of the falls in the background very faintly with this amazing rock formation in the foreground. Edward Muybridge, who we were discussing earlier, who had done pioneering work in recording motion, was also a landscape photographer and got to Yosemite not too long after Carlton Watkins got there and made his own very memorable images. But again, we can see the issue with the further the landscape was from the camera, the fainter it became because of this problem with the with blue light. And this is a particularly clear view of Yosemite Valley. And similar to views that we would later see by Ansel Adams and the iconic images, the ones that most people are aware of and think of when they think of Yosemite. In this image, though, we actually get to see some of the sky. It appears that that was perhaps burned in later by exposing the sky to much longer to the light under the enlarger. This may have even preceded enlargers, in which case, if it was a contact print, then certain areas would be shaded from the light when the print was being exposed in order to keep them from going too dark. While that was happening in the States, there were European photographers, of course, who were working in largely natural landscapes. Peter Hammery Emerson was a British photographer, and Britain being a much smaller place than the United States, there are far, or even in the 19th century, there were far fewer locations where the hand of man wasn't visible. And as a result, we see boats and people and other things going on. These images, he photographed extensively in the moors and other areas that are distinctly from the British Isles. I think this is a pretty sensational image with the reeds in the foreground. It looks very much like painting. In this frozen lake with a couple of several people in the distance, one under the tree and two figures, one close to the lake and pond, and another off in the distance. And I'd mentioned diagonals as we were talking about action and sports images, but diagonals play a large part in composition, certainly in landscape and virtually anything else. But here, the leaning of this tree is particularly dynamic. And here we see much more detail than in most of the rest of Emerson's pictures, which tend to be more about sort of the overall landscape. Eugene Ache, who is primarily known for his Paris photography, also went out into the suburbs and areas outlying Paris and photographed the natural world. Trees in particular in the city drew him, but also in the landscape. Again, diagonals, very important. and also photographing individual trees. And here we see the vignetting that occurred in many of Ache's images, because the lenses that he used were already pretty much outmoded by the time he was using them. They did not cover the full film area adequately, and as a result, what we see are the shadows of the edge of the image of the lens, which is, of course, always round. With a lesser photographer, it would just look like a mistake, and with Ache, it becomes a framing device. And details of trees, and even roots. Alfred Stieglitz, also known more for his urban city photography. He had a place upstate New York, I believe in the Catskills, and he spent a lot of time up there and photographed in all kinds of weather. But he also, generally on trips to this house outside of the city, he began to develop this notion that he had about equivalence, where he would see something resembling the human form in clouds, and vice versa. And in this series on equivalence, tried to show this connection between forms. And it wasn't just clouds and human forms, it was others as well. But those are the most striking of the ones that he recorded. And they're certainly remarkable images in and of themselves, even without the equivalence concept behind them.